In the quiet autumn of 1970, Sacramento was a city still basking in the simplicity of a pre-digital world. The neighborhoods were friendly, the air cool with the promise of fall, and crime rarely shattered the peace of its suburban streets. But on the night of October 25, something unspeakable happened inside an unassuming apartment on Bell Street, a crime so brutal it would haunt detectives for over half a century. The victim was Nancy Marie Benelak, a 28-year-old woman whose life seemed to be only just beginning. Nancy Benelak was well known in the Sacramento County Courthouse. She worked as a respected court reporter, admired for her professionalism and warmth. Friends described her as intelligent, meticulous, and kind-hearted. She had an infectious smile that made even long court days seem lighter. Outside of work, Nancy was a woman in love. She was engaged to a local man, and the couple was in the midst of planning their wedding for the following spring. Her life was moving forward beautifully: career success, a loving fiancé, and a stable home in a modest, well-kept apartment complex just minutes from downtown. Nancy lived on the second floor of her building. Her apartment overlooked a small courtyard and was decorated with care. Friends said she loved reading and music, and she kept her home tidy, cozy, and full of life. But on that last October night, someone entered that peaceful world and destroyed it forever. On the 25th of October 1970, Nancy spent her evening with her fiancé. They had dinner together, talked about their upcoming wedding, and watched television. Later that night, around 11 p.m., he said goodbye at her apartment door. She promised to call him the next morning before work, but that call never came. When she didn't show up for work the next day, and calls went unanswered, concern quickly grew. Her fiancé returned to the apartment complex around midday on October 26. What he found would forever change his life. Nancy's apartment door was locked, but through a window, he could see a terrible scene. He immediately called the police. When officers forced their way inside, they found Nancy dead in her bedroom, lying on the floor beside her bed. She had been stabbed more than 30 times. The attack was frenzied, violent, and deeply personal. The coroner would later report that Nancy had also been nearly decapitated. She fought fiercely for her life, but the brutality of the assault overwhelmed her. There were no signs of forced entry. Investigators quickly theorized that the killer might have climbed the balcony to reach her second-story apartment. Blood was found both inside and on the railing, suggesting the attacker had injured himself during or after the assault. Detectives began their work immediately. In 1970, however, forensic science was primitive compared to today. There was no DNA testing, no genetic genealogy, and no digital databases. Police relied on fingerprints, blood typing, and witness statements. They interviewed neighbors throughout the apartment complex. One resident recalled hearing a woman scream late that night, but no one had seen anyone suspicious. Another tenant thought they heard someone running down the stairs around midnight. Investigators learned that Nancy's apartment complex was generally safe, but a few residents mentioned a man named Richard John Davis, a 27-year-old who lived in an apartment across the courtyard. Davis was known to be quiet, but occasionally volatile. Still, there was no solid evidence linking him to the crime, and without forensic tools, police couldn't tie him to the scene. In the months that followed, detectives interviewed dozens of people, friends, co-workers, ex-boyfriends, and even strangers seen near the building that night. But every lead fizzled out. The case grew cold. By early 1971, the murder of Nancy Benelak had become one of Sacramento's most puzzling mysteries. Over the next several decades, technology advanced, but Nancy's case sat unsolved in police archives. Her family and friends never stopped hoping for justice. Detectives retired, new ones took their place, and the case file thickened with reports, tips, and dead ends. In the early 2000s, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit began re-examining unsolved homicides using emerging forensic methods. In 2004, investigators decided to revisit the evidence from Nancy's apartment. When the crime scene photos and reports were reviewed, something stood out: the blood trail found on the balcony railing. At the time of the original investigation, it was only noted as possibly belonging to the suspect. But with modern DNA extraction methods, even old, degraded blood could reveal powerful clues. Forensic analysts carefully extracted a DNA profile from the preserved evidence. They entered it into CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System, used by law enforcement to identify suspects across the country. But the result came back empty. There was no match. Once again, the case went cold. 15 more years passed. By 2019, genetic genealogy, the same technology that helped identify the Golden State Killer, was revolutionizing criminal investigations. Detectives realized that Nancy's case was a perfect candidate for this new approach. With approval from the district attorney, forensic experts submitted the suspect's DNA profile to public genealogy databases. Unlike CODIS, which contains only profiles of convicted offenders, these databases include DNA voluntarily uploaded by everyday people researching their ancestry. The breakthrough came slowly. Genealogists built a family tree starting from distant genetic matches, second and third cousins, and painstakingly worked backward. Each branch led closer to a single name: Richard John Davis. Davis, it turned out, had lived directly across the courtyard from Nancy in 1970. He was roughly the same age, and neighbors remembered him as reclusive. He'd left Sacramento not long after the murder and eventually died in 1997 at the age of 54. Investigators tracked down surviving relatives of Davis and obtained DNA samples from them. The comparison confirmed it. The blood at the scene belonged to Davis. After more than 50 years, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office finally had its answer. When the results came in, cold case detectives held a private meeting to go over every detail. The evidence was conclusive. Davis had been the killer all along. Investigators believe that Davis, for reasons still unclear, became fixated on Nancy. He was known to observe her from his apartment window and may have been attracted to her. On the night of the murder, they believe he taped his fingertips to avoid leaving fingerprints, climbed up to her balcony, and entered through the sliding door. Whether Nancy knew him or not remains uncertain. It's possible she recognized him and let her guard down. Others think she confronted him after hearing a noise. What's certain is that the encounter turned violent almost immediately. The wounds suggested rage, repeated stabbing, overkill, and personal fury. Detectives later theorized that Davis may have been mentally unstable or under the influence of alcohol at the time. His later life, marked by drinking and isolation, supported that theory. Because Davis died decades before his identification, he was never brought to justice. Yet for the detectives who had worked the case for years, and for Nancy's surviving loved ones, closure finally arrived. Announcement and aftermath. On the 10th of August 2022, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. Standing before cameras, Sheriff Scott Jones announced that they had identified the man responsible for Nancy's death. Behind him stood veteran detectives and members of Nancy's family. "Though we can't bring Nancy back," Jones said, "we hope this brings peace to those who have waited so long for answers." For many in the Sacramento community, the announcement was emotional. Some courthouse colleagues still remembered Nancy vividly, her laughter in the hallways, her dedication to her work. Her fiancé, though he had long since built a new life, had carried the memory of that night with him for decades. Nancy's case became the oldest cold case ever solved in Sacramento County history. It was also another testament to the power of DNA technology and forensic genealogy, showing how science could reach across time to expose the truth. Legacy of a 52-year mystery. The murder of Nancy Marie Benelak is more than a closed case. It's a story of persistence. For over half a century, investigators refused to let her memory fade. Each new generation of detectives inherited her file, hoping that technology might someday catch up to the evidence left behind. In the end, it did. Nancy's case stands as an example of how one drop of blood, preserved through decades of evidence storage, can one day reveal the face of a killer. It also underscores the evolution of criminal forensics, from fingerprints and blood typing to complex DNA sequencing and genealogical matching. But beyond the science lies something more human: the enduring commitment to justice. Detectives often speak about Nancy as if they knew her personally, even those who were not yet born when she was killed. They describe a feeling of responsibility, a promise to her, and to every cold case victim whose story remains unfinished. As Sheriff Jones summarized during the announcement, Nancy was never forgotten, and now she never will be. The 26th of July, 1989, a hot, stifling night in a quiet Kansas City neighborhood. In the upstairs bedroom of a modest home, 16-year-old Fawn Marie Cox lay sleeping. Her family, downstairs or elsewhere in the house, remained unaware of the horror quietly unfolding above them. By dawn, that silence would be shattered with a discovery that would haunt this family, this community, and the detectives assigned to the case for more than 30 years. Fawn Marie Cox was a typical teenager of her time. A busy schedule working at the local amusement park, spending time with friends, living with her parents and two younger sisters in Kansas City, Missouri. She'd recently gotten her learner's permit. She liked hanging out, listening to music. Her family described her as full of life and promise. On the evening of the 25th of July, 1989, she had finished her shift at the amusement park and returned home about 11 p.m. Her mother drove her home. Aware of the heat, Fawn slept alone that night upstairs. The air conditioning made the lower level loud enough that any noise above might not be heard. At some point during the early hours of July 26, someone climbed into the house through a second-floor window. They entered the room where Fawn slept. They sexually assaulted her and then strangled her to death. She was discovered the next morning when her alarm clock rang and there was no answer. Her mother and sister went upstairs and found her unresponsive. There were signs of forced entry via the window. Semen stains were found on the sheet, and the nature of the crime indicated the attacker knew something of the house's layout and how to enter and exit without waking the family downstairs. Investigators later noted how the family's dog had been agitated that night, though the noise of the AC masked the unusual sounds. The silence of the night became complicit in the crime. In the immediate aftermath, the Kansas City Police Department, KCPD, launched an intense investigation. 3 teenagers were initially arrested and charged, one even held for 8 months. But sooner than later, the investigation ran into roadblocks. The key witness recanted their testimony. DNA and forensic science in 1989 were limited. Hair, semen, and blood samples could be collected, but there was no definitive match, and charges were dropped. Captain Ben Caldwell of the KCPD's Missing Persons Cold Case section later reflected, "This one touched a lot of people because she was an innocent child who was murdered in her own bed." The case went cold. Over the years, the family grew older. The detectives moved on. The neighborhood carried the memory of the crime. Yet the question remained: who killed Fawn Marie Cox? One of the most chilling aspects, despite the suspect entering undetected and leaving undetected, the crime scene held biological evidence, bodily fluids collected from the victim's bedroom and the attacker's contact. In the early 2000s, crime lab scientists developed a DNA profile from that evidence and submitted it to CODIS, the National DNA Index System. The result? No match. For decades, the family pushed for renewed investigation, new technology, fresh hope. They raised money, spoke publicly. Billboards were placed. They refused to let Fawn's name fade into the shadows. In 2019 to 2020, the tide began to turn. Advances in forensic genealogy, using DNA, public ancestry databases, and family trees opened doors previously locked. KCPD, with federal support via Operation Legend, re-examined the case as a candidate for genealogical DNA testing. Investigators built out a family tree from distant genetic matches to identify a pool of possible suspects. One name emerged: Donald Cox Jr., Fawn's cousin. He had lived nearby at the time of the murder and had been long suspected, but no evidence existed to charge him. He died in 2006 of a drug overdose, but a key piece: because his death had been investigated by the medical examiner, a blood sample had been retained. Crime lab staff extracted the DNA from that sample and compared it to the forensic profile from Fawn's case. It was a match. On the 10th of November 2020, KCPD detectives notified Fawn's family that the case had been solved. The suspect had been identified, though deceased. For the family, it was a mixture of sorrow and relief. The person who destroyed their daughter's life was one of their own, someone they had trusted by virtue of family ties, and yet unknown in that moment of horror. Though no trial could take place, no courtroom verdict issued, the identification brought what many call closure, a name to the face behind the crime. The mystery lifted, the wound sealed a bit tighter. Captain Caldwell noted, "I never thought I would live to see the day." But he did. And so did Fawn's parents and sister, who had carried the grief for decades. NortheastNews.net. The murder of Fawn Marie Cox stands as a stark reminder of several truths: the vulnerability of youth, the unseen danger within familiar places, and the power of patience and science. In 1989, investigators lacked the tools to solve what now seems solvable, but evidence preserved carefully bodily fluids. Crime scene swabs became the key decades later. This case underscores how genealogical DNA testing can crack even the coldest cases when databases, family trees, and modern labs align. Yet it also raises questions. Why did it take so long? Did the case languish because of limited resources, competing priorities, or simply the era's technological limitations? For the community, for the family, the legacy is twofold. Fawn is no longer just a name. She is remembered, and the deterrent message is clear. Time may pass, but justice, in some form, can still arrive. Fawn Marie Cox was 16, full of life, on a summer night just like so many others, when the world changed forever. 31 years later, the truth emerged not in a courtroom, but in a laboratory, in the careful preservation of evidence, and in the devotion of a family who never gave up. Her story lives on, not as a cold headline, but as a testament to memory, to science, and to the idea that even in the darkness, a name can still be spoken and finally answered.